The locals call it the Whispering Woods. I didn't believe in the stories, not at first, but now I know better. It all started when my friends dared me to spend the night in the woods. Just me, my camera, and whatever might lurk in the darkness. I was never one to back down from a challenge, especially not from them. They knew how much I loved ghost stories, and they thought this would freak me out. But I thought, what's the worst that could happen? I packed my gear, made sure the camera batteries were full, and headed out as the sun began to set. The entrance to the woods was a narrow dirt path, barely visible from the road. I took a deep breath and stepped in. The moment I crossed that threshold, everything felt different. The air was colder, sharper somehow, and there was this overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. Every crunch of leaves beneath my boots echoed louder than it should have. I tried to shake off the unease. It was just nerves, right? As the trees grew denser, the last rays of sunlight vanished, plunging the woods into a deep twilight. I flipped on my flashlight and began recording. Day 1, the Whispering Woods. Let's see if the legends are true, I said into the lens, trying to sound confident. But then I heard it. At first it was just a faint rustling, like the wind moving through the branches, but there was no wind. The trees stood still, their tall silhouettes frozen against the deepening dark. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't rustling anymore, it was whispering. Faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. I spun around, the flashlight beam bouncing off the trunks. Nothing, just shadows and trees. But the whispers persisted, growing clearer. It sounded like multiple voices whispering over each other, overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. My heartbeat quickened, but I kept moving deeper into the woods, telling myself it was just my imagination. I found a small clearing and set up camp. The air felt wrong, too still, too quiet, despite the constant whispering in the background. I decided to ignore it and focus on the fire. As the flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across the trees, I turned the camera back on. So far, it's just creepy, I said, trying to laugh, but the unease was creeping in faster than I expected. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, just like that. The silence hit me like a punch, and I froze, straining my ears to catch any sound. Nothing, not a single bird, not a breeze, nothing. That's when I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees behind me. I shot up, whipping the flashlight around. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too desperate. "Is someone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I sat back down, trying to calm my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept telling myself it was just the stories getting to me, but then something happened that I couldn't explain. The fire went out. Just like that. 1 second it was crackling, the next it was gone, leaving me in total darkness. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for the flashlight, my fingers trembling. When I turned it on, my blood ran cold. Standing just beyond the trees, barely visible in the beam's edge, was a figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I called out again, but my voice was barely a whisper. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. I took a step forward, and that's when it vanished. Not like it ran away. 1 second it was there, the next it was just gone. I should have left right then. I should have grabbed my gear and run, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe I was too scared to move, or maybe part of me thought it was still just some trick, some prank. But I was wrong. The whispers returned, louder now, more frantic. They seemed to come from inside my head, echoing and overlapping. I could almost make out words, but not quite. The footsteps came back too, circling me. I spun around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, but the flashlight's beam caught only shadows. Then I saw it again, closer this time. The same figure. But now it wasn't alone. There were more of them, all standing just at the edge of the light, watching me. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. I backed up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I stumbled, dropping the flashlight. It hit the ground and went out, plunging me into total darkness. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. I could feel them closing in, the whispers all around me, inside me. My body felt cold, like the temperature had dropped suddenly. My breath came out in visible puffs, and then, just as suddenly as it had all started, it stopped. The whispers faded, the footsteps ceased, the air warmed again, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. I stood there in the darkness, trembling, not daring to move, to breathe. When I finally gathered the courage to turn on the flashlight again, they were gone. No figures, no eyes, no whispers. Just the quiet, empty woods. I didn't stay to figure out what happened. I grabbed my things and ran, never looking back. I don't know what I saw in those woods, but I'm never going back to find out. People still tell stories about the whispering woods, about the figures in the dark and the voices that follow you. I used to laugh at those stories, but not anymore. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I've always heard the stories about Hollow Grove, but I never believed them. How could a patch of trees just outside of town be haunted? It didn't make sense. That is, until the night I decided to find out for myself. It started as a dare, like these things always do. My friends thought it would be hilarious to challenge me to spend one night alone in the Hollow Grove. They called me out in front of everyone at a bonfire party, knowing I couldn't say no. I agreed, playing it off like it was no big deal. After all, I wasn't scared of some local legend. The sun was setting when I arrived at the edge of the forest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The entrance was marked by a worn wooden sign with faded letters barely legible, Hollow Grove. I turned on my camera and spoke into it, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Here I am, about to spend the night in Hollow Grove. Let's see if the ghosts want to play. I walked in, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the only sound. The further I went, the quieter it got. It wasn't long before the world outside the forest felt like it had disappeared entirely. The air was different in here, heavier. Every breath felt like it was soaked in dampness, like the forest was pressing in on me. After walking for a while, I found a clearing where I set up camp. The last of the sunlight bled out of the sky, leaving the forest bathed in the cool glow of twilight. I sat by my small fire, looking around at the dense thicket of trees that surrounded me. They stood so close together it was hard to see more than a few feet beyond the clearing. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling in the distance. I paused, listening. It wasn't the wind. No breeze stirred the branches above. I stood up and shined my flashlight into the woods. Nothing. I laughed to myself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Probably just an animal, I muttered. But the forest didn't feel right. It felt like it was watching me. I tried to ignore it, busying myself with filming. Still no sign of anything unusual, I said, panning the camera around. Maybe all the stories are just... I stopped mid-sentence. Something moved between the trees. A flash of white, darting from one tree to another. My heart skipped. Did you see that? I whispered, pointing the camera toward where I thought I saw it, but there was nothing now, just the dense trees. I stepped closer to the edge of the clearing, scanning the shadows. Hello? Is anyone there? Silence. Not even a cricket chirped. I backed away slowly, feeling the prickle of eyes on the back of my neck. I was just about to sit back down by the fire when the temperature dropped. Not gradually either. It was like stepping into a freezer. My breath came out in misty puffs, and the fire seemed to dim, the flames shrinking as if they were being smothered. That's when I heard it, a voice. Faint, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Leave. I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly through the trees. Who's there? Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just that same suffocating silence. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination when I saw something. No, someone. Standing just beyond the clearing. My blood went cold. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress, her skin pale as moonlight. She stood perfectly still, watching me with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman's lips parted and she whispered again, louder this time. Leave. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over my tent. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears as I tried to keep the flashlight steady. I blinked, and she was gone. Just like that. No sound, no trace. As if she'd never been there at all. My rational mind tried to reason with what I'd seen. Maybe it's just a trick of the light, I told myself, though I didn't believe it. I turned the camera back on, trying to capture my thoughts. Okay, something's definitely not right here. I just saw a woman, or I think I did. She told me to leave. I didn't wait for any more signs. I started packing up my gear as fast as I could. But before I could finish, the fire went out completely, plunging me into pitch black darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight. When I clicked it on, the beam barely penetrated the thick shadows now clinging to the trees. I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling the clearing. And then came the whispers. Dozens of voices, all overlapping, filling the air like a storm of sound. Get out. Leave. You don't belong here. I turned in circles, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could feel something closing in, something unseen. I grabbed my gear and ran, stumbling over roots and fallen branches as I bolted for the path. As I neared the edge of the woods, I glanced back just once. The woman was there again, standing at the tree line, watching me. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, their shapes barely human, their faces twisted and obscured. They didn't move. They didn't have to. Their presence alone was enough to send ice through my veins. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the woods and onto the road. The moment I crossed the threshold, the whispers stopped. The cold lifted. The forest behind me stood silent, as if nothing had happened, but something had happened, and I'll never forget it. Hollow Grove isn't just haunted. It's a place where the dead still roam, where they whisper warnings to those foolish enough to enter. I was one of the lucky ones. I listened. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a quick trip, just me, my friend Jake, and a weekend away from the city, camping deep in the heart of Whispering Pines, a forest infamous for its strange, unsettling rumors. I never really bought into ghost stories, but I loved the thrill of scaring myself. Jake, on the other hand, was a diehard skeptic. He liked to say, "Ghosts? Give me a break, man." We arrived at the forest early on a Saturday morning, the fog still clinging to the trees like a veil. The pines towered overhead, their needles swaying slightly in the wind, creating a low, whispering sound that seemed to follow us no matter where we went. I remember laughing it off at first. "Guess the forest lives up to its name," I said. Jake nodded, smirking. "Yeah, it's just the wind." We set up camp near the edge of a small, dark pond, surrounded by trees so thick that even the midday sun struggled to pierce through. As the sun began to sink, the shadows grew longer and the whispers in the trees seemed to grow louder. It was like something was moving just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the light. "All right, I'll bite," Jake said, grinning as we sat by the fire. "Tell me one of those creepy stories you love so much." I told him about the legend of the forest, how people claimed the woods were haunted by a woman who died centuries ago, a woman who was burned as a witch by the villagers nearby. They said she cursed the forest with her dying breath, promising to haunt anyone who entered her domain. People who came here at night heard her voice in the wind, and sometimes, just sometimes, they saw her charred, twisted figure wandering through the trees, searching for vengeance. Jake laughed. "That's ridiculous." I shrugged. "It's just the story." But as the night wore on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder, and the whispering in the trees became more distinct, almost like words, though I couldn't make them out. Every now and then I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees, vanishing before I could turn my head. Jake started getting uneasy, though he tried to hide it. "Let's go to bed," he said finally. "We've got a long hike tomorrow." We crawled into our sleeping bags inside the tent, the wind outside picking up, shaking the branches overhead, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't sleep. The whispering, it was louder now, like it was right outside the tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. "There." A voice, clear as day. "Come." It was soft, almost melodic, but with an edge that sent a chill through my bones. I looked over at Jake, but he was already asleep, snoring lightly. My heart was pounding, and despite everything in me telling me not to, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Nothing. Just the swaying trees and the mist curling through the forest floor. I zipped the tent back up and lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. Just my imagination. But then I heard it again. "Come." This time it was closer. Almost as if someone were standing just beyond the thin layer of nylon separating me from the woods. I shot up, heart racing. "Jake," I whispered, shaking him. "Jake, wake up." He grumbled, opening one eye. "What? What's wrong?" "You didn't hear that?" He rubbed his face. "Hear what?" "The voice. It sounded like it was right outside." Jake sighed, clearly irritated. "Dude, it's the wind. Go back to sleep." I sat there for a long time listening, but the voice didn't come again. Finally, I lay back down, though sleep didn't come easily. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, crunching the fallen leaves and pine needles just beyond the tent. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. An animal? Maybe? But the footsteps were too measured, too deliberate. Then there was a low rustling noise, and the tent walls shifted as if someone or something was brushing against them. I heard it again, that soft, melodic voice. "Come." I swallowed hard. my mouth dry. Slowly I turned to Jake, my voice barely a whisper. Jake! No response. Jake! I shook him harder, but he didn't move. Panic surged through me as I grabbed his arm and rolled him over. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His mouth hung slightly open, and his skin was pale. Too pale. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, shaking him violently. Jake! Jake! Wake up! But he wasn't asleep. He wasn't even breathing. I stumbled out of the tent, heart pounding in my ears. The air was thick with fog, and the trees loomed like twisted shadows in the dark. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I saw her. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the glow of the dying campfire, was a figure. She was tall and thin, her skin blackened and charred, her hair hanging in ragged, wet strands around her face. Her eyes were nothing but empty, hollow sockets, but I could feel them watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as she slowly lifted one blackened, twisted hand and pointed directly at me. Come. The word echoed through the trees, and suddenly I could hear it all around me. Whispers, dozens of voices, all saying the same thing. Come, come, come. I turned and ran. I don't remember much after that, just the trees whipping past me as I ran, the sound of those voices chasing me through the forest. I didn't stop until I reached the road, my legs burning, lungs on fire. When I finally collapsed, I was miles from the campsite. I called the police, told them everything, but they never found Jake. They searched the woods for days, but it was like he had vanished into thin air. But I know what happened. She took him, and I barely escaped. Now, every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers. And I know that one day she'll come for me, too.
Story number 4.
I've always been a sucker for adventure. Hiking, exploring abandoned places, camping in remote areas, you name it. So when my buddies dared me to spend a night in Black Hollow Woods, I didn't think twice. Sure, everyone in town had heard the stories about the place, but I wasn't one to buy into local ghost tales. Black Hollow Woods had a reputation. People talked about strange sightings and a few disappearances over the years, but no one had any real proof. It was just one of those places that gave people the creeps. The thing is, I'd been through plenty of forests and heard all kinds of weird noises. What could be so different about this one? I packed a small bag, grabbed my flashlight, and headed out just before sunset. The sky was already turning dark by the time I reached the edge of the woods. Tall, ancient trees stretched up like twisted fingers, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was thick, like it hadn't moved in ages. As I stood there, a weird chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just nerves. The first hour of the hike was uneventful. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. Every so often, I'd hear the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush or the distant hoot of an owl. It was normal forest stuff. But after a while, something changed. I'm not sure when exactly it started, but I began to feel watched. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Every step I took, it felt like there was someone or something right behind me, matching my pace. I stopped and swung my flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. Still, that feeling of being watched lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, I muttered to myself. But the further I walked, the heavier the air became. The forest seemed to close in on me. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches weaving together like a cage. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so quiet I thought I'd imagined it at first. But then it came again, closer this time. The words were garbled, like someone was trying to speak through a mouthful of water. My heart started to race. I spun around, pointing my flashlight into the dark, but there was no one there. I stood frozen for a moment, straining my ears. The whisper came again, this time from the direction I was heading. It was clearer now, though I still couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a voice, soft but insistent, calling me deeper into the forest. Logic told me to turn back, but something else, curiosity maybe, pushed me forward. I kept walking, my grip on the flashlight tightening. The whisper grew louder, and with it came a growing sense of dread, like the air itself was thickening, making it harder to breathe. And then I saw her. At first, it was just a glimpse, something pale moving between the trees up ahead. My flashlight flickered as I stepped closer, and that's when I saw her clearly. A woman, standing in the clearing, her back to me. She wore an old-fashioned white dress, torn and dirty, hanging off her like a shroud. Her long, dark hair was matted, and her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent in the beam of my light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to stay calm. She didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" Still no response. I stepped closer again, and that's when she turned. Her face, if you could call it that, was a twisted mask of horror. Her eyes were sunken, dark pits, and her mouth, it was wrong, stretched impossibly wide in a grotesque grin. A sound escaped her, a low, gurgling moan, like something trapped between life and death. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. She began to move toward me, slowly at first, but then faster, her limbs jerking unnaturally, as if pulled by invisible strings. I turned and bolted, crashing through the trees as fast as I could, the sound of her ragged breathing following close behind. My lungs burned as I ran, branches slashing at my face and arms, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the forest began to thin and I burst out onto the road, gasping for air. I collapsed onto the pavement, my heart hammering in my chest. When I finally looked back, the edge of the woods was silent. Still, there was no sign of her. I didn't wait to find out if she was still lurking in the shadows. I got up, legs shaking, and made my way back to my car as fast as I could. I never went back to Black Hollow Woods after that night, and I never told anyone what really happened. Not even my friends. They wouldn't believe me anyway. They'd say it was just my imagination, that I let the local legends me. But I know what I saw, and I still hear her sometimes in my dreams. That horrible whisper calling me back to the woods. I know better than to listen. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I've always been drawn to the strange, the unexplained, the kind of places people avoid. That's why I couldn't resist when I heard about the Shadow Trail. Supposedly, it's cursed, a place where people go missing without a trace, never to be seen again. Everyone in town knows the stories, but no one ever goes near it. Except me. I was looking for something thrilling, something that would give me a real scare. So, one evening just before dusk, I packed my camera and flashlight and headed for the trail. The entrance wasn't easy to find. Hidden deep within an old forest, the path was barely visible through the overgrown brush. It was as if the woods themselves didn't want to be disturbed. I stepped through the undergrowth, pushing branches out of the way until I found it. A narrow dirt path that snaked through the thick trees, disappearing into the gloom. I turned on my camera, my voice steady, even though my heart was already racing. Here we are. Shadow Trail. Let's see if the stories are true. The forest around me was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. I should have felt calm, but instead, it felt like the woods were watching me, like the trees themselves had eyes. As I walked deeper into the forest, the air grew colder. Not gradually, but suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. I stopped and zipped up my jacket, glancing behind me. Nothing but the trees, standing in silence. I kept moving, the path winding deeper into the woods. The light was fading fast, and the shadows stretched long and dark across the trail. I clicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam ahead of me, but it felt weak against the encroaching darkness. Then, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I focused, I realized there was something moving in the shadows. A figure. Just ahead, walking the trail. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but it was there, a dark silhouette moving slowly through the trees. "Hey!" I called out, surprised to see anyone else out here. But the figure didn't respond. It just kept walking, almost gliding deeper into the forest. I quickened my pace, trying to catch up. "Hey, do you know where this trail leads?" No answer. I sped up, my boots crunching on the dirt, but no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't close the distance. The figure always stayed just ahead, slipping in and out of the shadows as if it was part of them. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining above me like a canopy of skeletal hands. The path was becoming harder to follow, winding and narrowing until it felt like the forest was closing in on me. My flashlight flickered and I smacked it, cursing under my breath. Great! That's when I noticed something strange. The figure wasn't casting a shadow. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't realized it before, but the figure moved like it wasn't really there, like it was a part of the darkness itself. Suddenly, the air around me seemed to grow heavier, oppressive. The temperature dropped again, and the silence was broken by a sound, a low, distant whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized the sound wasn't coming from around me. It was coming from the trees. I whipped the flashlight toward the tree line, scanning for movement. The whispers grew louder, but I still couldn't make out any words. It was like dozens of voices were speaking at once, all just out of earshot. And then the figure stopped. It stood motionless, about 50 feet ahead in the middle of the trail. I couldn't see its face, only the dark outline of a person, completely still. My stomach twisted with a deep sense of dread, but I couldn't stop myself from walking forward. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaky now. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, my heart pounding. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't shake the pull of the thing in front of me. There was something wrong about it, something deeply unnatural, and I had to know. I took another step and the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, flashlight in hand, staring at the figure, and then it turned. I gasped, stumbling back. The figure's face, or what should have been its face, was completely blank. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless mask of shadow. It was as if the figure wasn't human at all, but a shape, a void where a person should be. It tilted its head, almost like it was studying me, and then it moved. But it didn't walk. It glided toward me, silent and fast, covering the distance between us in seconds. I scrambled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. My flashlight skittered out of my hand, and in the sudden darkness, the figure loomed over me, an outline against the night. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for the flashlight. The figure stood still again, just inches from me, and I could feel the cold radiating off it, like standing next to an open freezer. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The figure was gone. I scrambled to my feet, shining the light wildly in every direction. Nothing. The forest was empty, but I could still feel it, the cold presence, watching me. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My legs felt like lead, and the trail seemed to stretch endlessly before me. The trees blurred past as I sprinted through the darkness, the whispers returning, louder now, chasing me. Run. Run. I didn't stop until I burst out of the forest and onto the old road that led back to town. I collapsed, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were gone. The cold was gone. But I knew the figure wasn't. I haven't been back to the shadow trail since. I tell myself it was just my imagination, that I didn't really see what I think I saw. But deep down, I know the truth. Some things in the forest aren't meant to be found. Some paths are better left forgotten. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I used to laugh at ghost stories. I thought they were just tales people told to scare others, maybe for fun around a campfire. But everything changed the night I spent in Ravenwood Forest. Now, I'm the one who can't sleep without leaving a light on. Ravenwood was notorious in my town. People avoided it like the plague. There were rumors about hikers disappearing, strange lights seen at night, and a woman's voice calling from deep within the trees. It all sounded like nonsense to me, so when my friend Mike dared me to spend the night there, I accepted without hesitation. He bet me $50 I wouldn't last until dawn. I arrived at the forest just before sunset with nothing but a backpack, a flashlight, and my phone. The sky was painted in deep oranges and purples as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the entrance to the woods. The air was thick and cold, despite it being summer. I shook off the uneasiness that was creeping up on me and took a deep breath. As I stepped into the forest, the world around me seemed to change. The sounds of the town faded, replaced by the low rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. There was an odd silence that hung in the air, unnatural, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I kept walking, determined to prove this was all just in my head. About an hour in, the sun was completely gone, and the darkness swallowed everything around me. I flipped on my flashlight, the narrow beam barely cutting through the dense trees. The deeper I went, the thicker the woods became. The trees gnarled and twisted, their branches forming strange shapes that looked like reaching hands in the dim light. It was around then that I first heard it. At first, it was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I stopped in my tracks, listening. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The whisper wasn't random. It was like someone was trying to say something. A word. No, a name. My name. John. I spun around, flashing my light through the trees, but there was no one there. "Mike, is that you?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended, but there was no response, just the whisper, soft but insistent, calling my name again. John, come here. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping dread. Nice try, Mike. I'm not falling for it, I yelled into the dark. But the whisper didn't stop. It just grew closer, more persistent, like it was coming from all around me. My heartbeat quickened. I decided to keep moving, hoping the sound would go away once I was deeper into the woods. But it didn't. Every few minutes I heard it again, sometimes behind me, sometimes to the side, always calling my name in that same eerie voice. Suddenly, I saw something in the distance, a faint light flickering between the trees. It wasn't the glow of a phone or flashlight, it was something softer, almost like candlelight. For a moment, I felt a strange pull, an urge to follow it, to see where it was coming from. I took a few hesitant steps toward it, but then the whisper returned, louder this time, almost desperate. John, come closer. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back. I forced myself to stop walking and scanned the area with my flashlight, half expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows. That's when I saw her. Standing between the trees just beyond the reach of my light was a figure, a woman, pale and ghostly. Her long, dark hair hung loose over her face, her white dress torn and stained. She didn't move, just stood there, swaying slightly as if the wind was pushing her, though the air was completely still. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She lifted her head, and through the strands of hair, I saw her eyes, dark, hollow, and filled with something that made my stomach twist in fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a sound like the wind through dead leaves filled the air, growing louder and louder until it became a deafening roar. I turned and ran. Branches slapped at my face and arms as I sprinted through the woods, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The whisper followed me, growing louder and more frantic with each step. John! John! Come back! I didn't stop. I couldn't. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely managing to stay on my feet. The light in the distance flickered again, this time closer, but I ignored it, focusing only on getting out of the forest. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the trees began to thin, and I saw the faint glow of the road ahead. Relief washed over me, and I pushed myself harder, not stopping until I was out of the woods and back at my car. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, my whole body trembling. I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see the woman standing at the edge, watching me. But there was nothing, just the still, silent trees. I never collected that $50 from Mike. I never went back to Ravenwood either. People still tell the stories, still talk about the strange lights and whispers in the woods, but I don't laugh anymore, because I know the truth. There's something in Ravenwood, something that watches, something that waits, and it knows your name. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The Weeping Woods were a place of local lore, whispered about in hushed tones around campfires and during sleepovers. Don't go near them after dark, they'd say, eyes wide with fear. The trees cry, and if you hear them, it's already too late. I always thought it was nonsense. Just stories to scare children. That was until I found myself standing at the edge of the forest one fateful evening, armed with nothing but my curiosity and a flashlight. I had to see for myself if the tales were true. The entrance to the Weeping Woods was marked by ancient trees whose gnarled branches twisted together, creating an archway that felt like a gateway to another world. The air felt heavy, charged with an electric tension as I stepped inside. Immediately, the sunlight faded and shadows danced around me. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot echoed eerily, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I walked deeper into the woods, the trees towering above me like silent giants. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, the rustling of small animals, had vanished, replaced by an unsettling stillness. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. After a while, I noticed something strange. The trees were thickly lined with what looked like small, dark stains running down their trunks. I leaned closer, my flashlight illuminating the bark. It looked like sap, but it was too dark, almost like dried blood. Shivers ran down my spine. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But curiosity pushed me onward. As I continued down the path, I heard it, a soft, sorrowful sound that pierced the silence. It was a weeping sound, like a child crying softly in the distance. My heart raced. I had to know what it was. I followed the sound, the weeping growing louder with every step. The path narrowed and the trees closed in around me, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out the sky. The air grew colder and the sobbing became almost palpable, wrapping around me like a shroud. Suddenly, I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, its trunk wider than my arms could span. Dark stains ran down its bark, pooling at its base. And beneath the tree, something caught my eye. A woman knelt on the ground, her back to me. Her long, dark hair hung like a curtain around her face, obscuring her features. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to blend in with the shadows. The weeping came from her, deep and heart-wrenching. I hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the compulsion to approach her. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice shaky. "What's wrong?" She stopped crying but didn't turn around. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step closer. "Can I help you?" At that moment, she slowly turned to face me. My breath caught in my throat. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were black, like the dark stains on the trees. "Why have you come?" she asked, her voice a haunting echo that sent chills down my spine. I just wanted to see the woods," I stammered. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her gaze piercing into my soul. "They will come for you if you stay." Before I could respond, I felt it, a shift in the air, a sense of movement around me. The trees creaked and swayed, their branches twisting in a way that felt almost alive. Shadows slithered between the trunks, dark shapes that seemed to grow and expand. I turned back to the woman, panic rising in my chest. "What do you mean? Who will come?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she reached out a trembling hand, pointing into the forest. "Run. Don't look back." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly in front of me. The whispers returned, now a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some angry, all echoing through the trees. "Stay with us. Don't leave. You can't escape." My heart raced as I stumbled through the underbrush, branches scratching at my arms and legs. The path seemed to twist and turn, leading me deeper into the woods instead of out. I could feel the presence behind me, lurking just out of sight, as if it were toying with me, letting me think I could escape. Just when I thought I'd lost all hope, I broke free from the dense trees and into a small clearing that looked familiar. The exit wasn't far now. I pushed myself to run faster, desperate to reach the safety of the outside world. But as I crossed the threshold into the light, I felt an icy grip on my ankle, pulling me back. I screamed, fighting against the invisible force, my hands clawing at the ground. And then I heard her voice again, echoing from the shadows. "Don't let them take you." With a final surge of adrenaline, I yanked my foot free and tumbled out of the forest. I landed on the grass outside, gasping for breath as I looked back at the trees. They stood still and silent, but I could swear I saw shadows moving within the trunks, dark figures watching me from the depths of the woods. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached the safety of my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman or the shadows lurking at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing, just the dark silhouette of the weeping woods fading into the distance. I don't think I'll ever return to those woods. Some places hold secrets better left undisturbed, and some weeping isn't meant to be heard. And as the stories go, if you listen too closely, you might find yourself joining the mournful cries of the lost. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I've always loved hiking, especially through secluded trails. There's something calming about nature that makes me forget my worries. But Pine Hollow? That's a different story. It's known around here as the Cursed Path. People avoid it, whispering tales of shadowy figures and ghostly cries echoing through the trees. Naturally, I thought I was brave enough to take it on. One crisp autumn evening, with the sun setting behind the mountains, I decided to test my luck. Armed with my trusty backpack, a flashlight, and an insatiable curiosity, I headed out. The first part of the trail was beautiful. The trees ablaze with reds and yellows, leaves crunching beneath my boots. The fresh air was invigorating. I had no idea that within hours my life would change forever. As I ventured deeper, the beauty of the forest faded. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. A chill crept in, making me shiver despite the layers I wore. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to the falling temperatures, and pressed on. After an hour, the sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness enveloped me. I flipped on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating the twisting path ahead. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but when I turned around, there was nothing. Just the trees standing still, watching. I quickened my pace, the sound of my own heart beating loudly in my ears. It felt like something was following me, something that wanted me to turn around, but I refused. I kept moving forward, determined not to let fear control me. The whispers began soon after. They were faint at first, like the wind rustling through the leaves, but as I continued down the path, they grew clearer, distinct words emerging from the chaos of nature. Turn back. Leave now. A chill ran down my spine. I stopped dead in my tracks, scanning the darkness around me. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure dart between the trees. Panic surged through me. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling. Is anyone there? Silence. Then I heard it again, a soft, almost pleading voice, closer this time. Help me. Please. My heart raced. I didn't know whether to run or investigate. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the path, following the sound deeper into the woods. The air was thick and heavy, every breath tasting stale. I knew I should turn back, but curiosity gnawed at me. After a few moments of walking, I stumbled into a small clearing. The moonlight illuminated the area, and my flashlight beam caught something on the ground. I approached cautiously. It was a tattered old photograph, the edges frayed and yellowed with age. In it was a young woman, her smile bright and carefree. But behind her, partially obscured by shadows, stood a figure, a dark silhouette, watching. A shiver raced down my spine as I realized the figure looked eerily familiar. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. Help me! Help me! Without thinking, I turned and ran. The path twisted before me like a maze, the trees closing in around me. My flashlight flickered again, and just as it died, I felt something brush against my arm. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but the darkness swallowed everything. I was utterly alone, or so I thought. Turn back. The voice echoed again, this time sounding closer, almost beside me. I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination. Desperate, I dashed back in the direction I came, stumbling over roots and fallen branches, fighting the urge to scream. But then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, not behind me, but right next to me. I was being followed. Help me, please. I couldn't take it anymore. I sprinted down the path, lungs burning, the weight of unseen eyes on my back. The darkness felt alive, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I just wanted out. I burst through the trees and into the clearing I had passed earlier, desperately searching for the path back to safety. And that's when I saw her. The woman from the photograph stood at the edge of the clearing, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. You have to leave, she screamed, her voice piercing the silence. They're coming for you. You shouldn't have come here. I was frozen in place, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Who are you? I shouted, panic clawing at my chest. But she didn't answer. Instead, she pointed back into the woods. You have to run. Now. Without thinking, I turned and bolted. The woods closed in around me, but I didn't look back. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, the whispers turning into shouts, warning me to leave, urging me to turn back. I broke through the trees and stumbled onto the main path, gasping for breath, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as I fished them out of my pocket. My hands were shaking as I jumped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. I turned on the engine, glancing back at the forest. Everything looked still, but I knew better. As I sped away, I could still hear the whispers, fading into the distance, mixed with the sound of my own racing heartbeat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. But there was nothing. It's been weeks since that night, and I still can't shake the feeling of dread that lingers whenever I think about Pine Hollow. I've heard the stories about those who venture into the woods, never to return, and now I understand. I never went back to that cursed path, and I never will. Story the end.
Story number 9.
Growing up in the small town of Millfield, I heard all the tales about the Dark Hollow Forest. The older kids would gather around the fire pit during sleepovers, weaving chilling stories about what lurked among the trees. They spoke of an evil presence, something that could sense fear and feed off it, a shadow that could take any form it desired. They called it the Lurker, and they swore it would draw you in with the promise of adventure, only to trap you forever. I was skeptical, of course. At 17, I was more interested in proving how brave I was than in believing in old wives' tales. So when my friends and I planned a weekend camping trip in the heart of Dark Hollow, I jumped at the chance. A little thrill-seeking in the woods? What could go wrong? The first night was uneventful. We set up our tents, roasted marshmallows, and told ghost stories that elicited laughter more than fear. But as darkness enveloped us, the atmosphere changed. The shadows seemed to deepen, and the forest around us felt alive, almost breathing. Around midnight, when most of us had settled into our tents, I heard it. A low, resonating hum that vibrated through the ground. I sat up, the sound crawling under my skin. I thought I might be imagining it, so I brushed it off and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. The hum grew louder, echoing through the trees. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Curious and a little frightened, I grabbed my flashlight and crept out of the tent. The others were still asleep, their snores mingling with the unsettling sound. I stepped into the cool night air, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I moved deeper into the forest, the hum morphed into a soft, melodic whisper. I strained to hear it, but the words were just out of reach. My heart raced, caught between fear and curiosity. What if it was just the wind, or perhaps someone else had come to the woods too? Following the sound, I found myself in a small clearing. Moonlight spilled through the trees, illuminating the ground, and in the center stood a massive, ancient oak tree. It looked almost unnatural, the bark twisted and gnarled as if it were alive and watching me. I stepped closer, captivated by the sight, but then I noticed something strange. Dark, inky shadows slithered along the roots of the tree, pooling around its base like a thick mist. They seemed to dance and sway, almost beckoning me closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The shadows pulsed in response, and the whispering grew louder. I took another step forward, drawn in by an inexplicable urge. Suddenly, the shadows shifted, forming a figure, a dark silhouette that loomed above me. I froze, terror washing over me. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and resonant, echoing from the tree itself. "You've come to play." I turned to run, but the ground beneath me shifted, and roots snaked out, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me toward the tree. Panic surged through me. "Let me go!" I screamed, struggling against the grip of the roots. "Stay," the voice commanded, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me, trying to drag me down into the darkness. It was suffocating, and the shadows began to close in. I realized I was not just fighting against the physical restraint. I was battling the very essence of fear that permeated the air. Summoning every ounce of strength, I focused on my flashlight, swinging it toward the figure. The beam hit the shadows, and for a moment they flickered, revealing a face twisted in anguish. A haunting visage that seemed to be part of the tree itself. I felt a jolt of energy surge through me. In that instant, I understood. This was the lurker, a manifestation of fear and despair, feeding off those who wandered too close. It thrived on the darkness in people's hearts, the insecurities and dread that festered within. With renewed determination, I yelled, "I won't let you take me." The words rang out, a challenge against the darkness. I twisted my legs, pulling free from the roots that bound me. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches scratching at my arms. The whispers turned to shrieks, echoing in frustration as I broke free from the clearing. The forest seemed to shift around me, the path I had taken now obscured, as if trying to disorient me. I stumbled, disoriented, my flashlight flickering, but I didn't dare stop. I could hear the lurker behind me, its presence looming, dark and malevolent, urging me to turn back. "Join us," it called, its voice slithering into my mind. "You'll be safe here." But I pushed on, fueled by adrenaline and fear. Finally, I burst through the thicket and into the open area where our campfire still glowed faintly, the embers flickering against the night sky. I collapsed to the ground, panting, the warmth of the fire wrapping around me like a protective blanket. I looked back toward the forest, half expecting to see the shadows lurking at the edge. But the trees stood still, silent and dark, their secrets hidden in the depths of the woods. My friends stirred from their sleep, groggy and confused. "What happened?" one of them asked, concern etched on their face. I struggled to find the words, shaking as I recounted my experience. They exchanged worried glances, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They thought I had just let the campfire stories get to me, but I knew the truth. The next morning, I insisted we leave early, and after a long debate, they reluctantly agreed. As we packed up our gear, I stole one last glance at the Dark Hollow forest. It loomed in the distance, its shadows stretching out like fingers reaching for the sky. To this day, I don't know if anyone else has encountered the lurker, but I do know this. The woods hold a darkness that can't be explained, a terror that can sense your fear and will do anything to pull you into the abyss. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, the shadows still dance, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close to hear the whispers and succumb to the lure of the lurking terror. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I never believed in the supernatural. At least I didn't until I spent that fateful night in Willow Creek. It's a small town, tucked away in the mountains where everyone knows everyone else, and rumors fly faster than the wind. But there was one story that sent chills down even the most skeptical of spines, the tale of the abandoned cabin in the woods. They say it's haunted, that the ghost of a woman named Eliza roams the grounds, searching for her lost child. Some claim to have seen her wandering the forest at dusk, her white dress flowing like mist, her cries echoing through the trees. Of course, I thought it was just a story, until I decided to investigate for myself. On a crisp fall evening, I gathered my gear, a flashlight, a camera, and my backpack, and set off for the woods. The sun dipped below the horizon as I reached the trailhead, and I felt an uneasy flutter in my stomach. But I brushed it off. I had a mission. I wasn't about to let a ghost scare me away. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the trees closed in around me, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. After an hour, I found the cabin, crumbling and overgrown just as the stories had described. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Dust motes danced in the air, and the floor creaked ominously beneath my feet. It was eerily quiet, the silence almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of history in the air, the secrets of those who had come before me. As I explored the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing soft whispers, like the rustling of leaves, and every time I turned around, there was nothing but shadows. Dismissing it as my imagination, I took out my camera, hoping to capture something, anything that would prove the legends true. But then, as I was about to leave, I heard it. A soft, sobbing sound came from the corner of the room, breaking the oppressive silence. My heart raced, and I turned slowly, my flashlight illuminating the darkened corner. There, sitting on the floor, was a figure. A woman in a tattered white dress, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. She was hunched over, her hands covering her face as she wept. I froze, torn between fear and an inexplicable urge to help. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She looked up, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Her eyes were hollow, filled with despair, and her lips parted in a silent scream. I took a cautious step closer, but as I did, she vanished, leaving only the faint scent of lavender in the air. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back, my back hitting the wall. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam shaking as I directed it around the cabin. "Is anyone there?" I called, my voice echoing back at me, but there was no response, only the oppressive silence. Heart racing, I made my way to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard her voice again, soft, melodic, yet filled with anguish. "Help me. Find him." I stopped, the weight of her words sinking in. "Who?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who do you need to find?" There was no answer, just a sudden gust of wind that rattled the windows. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "I'm sorry. I can't help you," I shouted, panic rising in my throat. But deep down, I knew that leaving her to suffer alone felt wrong. With a surge of determination, I stepped back into the cabin, scanning the room for anything that could point me in the right direction. My flashlight beam caught sight of a small wooden box tucked away in a corner, half buried under debris. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. Opening the box, I found a collection of old photographs, each one depicting a woman and a small child, laughing and playing in the very cabin I stood in. My stomach twisted at the sight. One photo caught my attention. It was a picture of the woman I had just seen, standing beside a boy with bright eyes, full of life. And then I noticed the date written on the back, 1897. "Please, help me." The voice was stronger now, echoing through the cabin. I realized then that Eliza wasn't just a ghost. She was a mother searching for her lost child, trapped in a cycle of despair. The sadness in her eyes haunted me, and I felt an overwhelming urge to find out what had happened to them. Determined, I began to search the cabin for clues. I rummaged through the dust-covered drawers and flipped over old furniture, hoping for anything that could shed light on their fate. Then, Beneath the floorboards, I found a small, tattered journal. It was Eliza's journal, filled with entries that chronicled her life, the love she had for her child, the joy of motherhood, and the horror of the day her son went missing in the woods. My heart ached for her as I read her desperate pleas for help and her growing despair over the years. But one entry caught my attention more than the others. It mentioned a tree, an old willow by the creek where they often played. Eliza believed he had wandered off there, and she had searched for him for days but never found him. Willow Creek, I whispered, realization dawning on me. That's where I need to go. As the words left my lips, the cabin shook and Eliza appeared again, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. Please, find him. I nodded, a newfound determination fueling me. I will! I promise! With that, I sprinted out of the cabin, my mind racing as I headed toward the creek. The whispers grew louder, guiding me through the trees. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the old willow tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. I dropped to my knees and began to dig at the base of the tree, heart pounding in anticipation. The air felt charged, electric with energy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My fingers brushed against something hard, and I unearthed a small, weathered box. Inside was a locket, tarnished with age. I opened it and my breath caught. Inside was a photograph of Eliza's son, the same boy from the cabin. I felt a surge of emotion as I realized I had found what she had been searching for all along. Thank you, I whispered, feeling a warmth wash over me. You can finally rest. As the words left my mouth, a gentle wind swirled around me, and I saw Eliza's spirit appear beside me, her expression one of peace. She reached for the locket, and as her fingers brushed against it, a soft glow enveloped her. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude before fading away into the night. The whispers ceased, and the forest felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. I sat there for a moment, overwhelmed by the experience. I returned to town that night, forever changed. I never spoke of what happened in Willow Creek, but I knew I had set a spirit free. Sometimes the stories are true. Sometimes the ghosts just need a helping hand. And I would never forget Eliza and her lost child.